Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week, after a much longer period of time than I was aware of, we're going to get back into the seedy underbelly of Rancor Island with Violent Messiahs number 4. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in November of 2004, we can see here once again Travis Smith doing a very Travis Smith cover. And there's nothing wrong with that. I am always a little bit, I guess, torn on the covers that were used for Violent Messiahs. Because while they are very cool, very artistic, they run this weird gambit of being somewhat obtuse a lot of times in their presentation, and also not necessarily jumping out at potential buyers who may be perusing the comic book store. Now, I say that in the sense that they're not super vibrant and colorful very often, but they also don't look like anything else that was on the shelf either, so they kind of had that going for them. Like I said, it's very weird to look at these covers and try and figure out exactly how well they did at drawing in potential new buyers for this book. Creators: Joshua D.M. Dessart, William O'Neill. Writer: Joshua D.M. Dessart. Pencils: Tone Rodriguez. Colors: Travis Smith. Inker: Marlo Alquiza, I believe is how you're supposed to say that. Jonathan Glapion. Letters: Dreamer Designs, Robin Spahar, maybe? Sorry, Robin, I gotta be saying that wrong. And Dennis Heisler. Cover: Travis Smith. CEO, Editor-in-Chief: Jan, or perhaps Jan, I'm not certain, Ustine O'Neill. Copy Editor: Paul Story. Administrative Assistant: R.J. Gameo. We see here that the story actually picks up a few moments before it ended in the previous issue, where we see Citizen Payne, aka Job, fighting his brother Jeremiah, aka the Family Man, and eventually get the upper hand where he throws Jeremiah out through the sliding glass doors that lead on to the balcony. However, as he's about to move out and finish the fight with his brother, he is interrupted when suddenly there's a huge crash and a bunch of police burst into Jeremiah's apartment. We then see Sherry Majors burst through the door, telling Job to freeze and put his hands up. We see Job looking back at them, realizing that both of his guns are empty from his recent battle with Jeremiah, and trying to weigh exactly what his options are. However, before any of that can happen, Detective Houston immediately yells at the other officers to open fire, which they immediately do, giving Job no other choice but to try and make a break for it as he tries to dash towards the nearest door, smashes through it, and finds himself in a bedroom of the apartment. As Detective Houston and the other police officers continue to fire into the apartment, Sherry realizes that Job has given her the slip before and decides that this time she's going to be smarter about the way she handles this, and instead of going into the apartment, she goes back and tries to cut off any other exits that he might be going for. Now, I have a few problems with this. Number one, at no point does Detective Houston give Job, aka Citizen Payne, an opportunity to surrender, and they just open fire execution style on him. The other problem I have with this is, I don't know how well it's showing up on camera here, but Citizen Payne has multiple laser sights fixed on his body in this shot right here before any of the police have opened fire, which means all of their guns were aimed perfectly on his body, yet somehow not a single bullet hits him. I understand he's supposed to be quite fast and agile, but they're only about 10 feet away from the man. Nobody's that quick unless they have superpowers, which, by the way, Job does not. So it does seem rather impossible that he wasn't struck by a single bullet from any of these officers. With the officers hot on his heels, Job realizes that he has inadvertently run into a dead end and has to figure out exactly how he's going to get himself out of this one. Meanwhile, out in the hallway, Sherry Majors has decided that she's basically got Job right where she wants him at this point, and even thinks to herself, let's see you get out of this one. However, her attention is drawn to a loud sound coming from the wall next to her as she looks over and notices that the plaster is cracking and breaking. This is because Job has decided to make his own exit as he smashes against the wall of the apartment, eventually breaking his way through and getting out into the hallway, where he immediately pins Sherry Majors against the opposite wall and is then struck by a hailstorm of buckshot as the police officers who were chasing him open fire. As Detective Houston catches up to the other officers, he immediately shouts at them to cease fire as he realizes that Citizen Payne has Sherry Majors pinned against the wall. Lieutenant Majors, however, uses this opportunity to try and get her own service pistol up into Job's face to try and end the situation. However, Job is too fast, and he immediately slaps the pistol out of her hand onto the ground. He then looks at her and says, "I promise I'll never really hurt you." Lieutenant Majors does not pay attention to any of this as she immediately starts to fight Job. However, her attacks are completely ineffective as he manages to block every one of her kicks and then grabs her hand, stating, "Forgive me." He then drags her down the hallway, holding onto her arm as she's becoming enraged and frustrated by the fact that he was able to defeat her so easily. He then lets her go as he slips out the exit. As Detective Houston tries to help Lieutenant Majors to her feet, she simply screams at him to not touch her, as the other two officers try to figure out what their next move should be. Lieutenant Majors then tells Detective Houston to go back into the apartment and check it out, while the other two officers are basically going on about how they wish they had some hollow points instead of this civilian-safe soft top stuff. However, Lieutenant Majors tells them both to shut up and follow her. Now, this is where I kind of have to get into a little bit of gun nerd stuff to explain why that doesn't make a whole lot of sense with the two officers we're talking about. They both seem to be carrying what I believe is supposed to be SPAS 12 shotguns, which, of course, it would be the most iconic movie/pop culture shotgun that you can think of. But at least in this situation, it makes sense because that gun was designed for police and military use. So the idea that two SWAT team members would be carrying them is definitely on par with what their design purpose was. However, they're firing buckshot. Now, in terms of buckshot's lethality, it comes down to a couple of things. Number one, how hot it's loaded. Number two, how many of the pellets are striking the target. In this case, we saw that all of the pellets basically were striking Job as they were firing from very close range. However, there is such a thing as hollow point buckshot, and hollow point buckshot does not function the same way as hollow point pistol rounds technically. A pistol round's hollow point expands on entry of a target to dump all of its energy and cause maximum damage to the target. Hollow point buckshot works a little bit differently. It still expands, but keep in mind that a buckshot pellet is much smaller than, say, a 9mm or 45 caliber bullet. So its expansion isn't creating that much larger of a wound cavity, but what it does do is slow the buckshot pellet down significantly. Keep in mind, that lower mass means that it doesn't take as much to stop that little pellet as it does a full-fledged pistol caliber bullet. Physics apply. An object in motion stays in motion. The more mass an object has, the more it takes to stop said object. So, the hollow point buckshot pellets are designed to not over-penetrate, which is exactly what a civilian-safe round would be, because you don't want your round to go through the intended target and potentially strike an innocent victim somewhere. So, the exact same thing that they're complaining about would still be the case if they were using the hollow point buckshot rounds that they wish they had. And this just goes into people who wrote this book not really knowing a whole lot about guns, but thinking that they knew a whole lot about guns because they had seen stuff in movies, I guess. Sorry for that little segue, folks, but I just kind of had to get that off my chest because it was kind of hurting my head when I read it. As Detective Houston re-enters the apartment, he lights up a cigarette and starts singing a little tune to himself. He then walks through the shattered sliding glass door out onto the balcony, where we see Job has used the distraction of the police opening fire on his brother to get himself out of harm's way and hang off the side of the balcony. He then drops to the balcony of the apartment below and manages to sneak inside. As he walks through the apartment, he can hear samba music playing and makes his way to a bedroom where two people are engaged in the act of lovemaking. As they continue on, the woman happens to see Jeremiah, standing in the doorway. She is terrified by this. However, he simply just puts his finger up to his lips, telling her to not make a sound, essentially, and grabs the clothing of the man she is with and makes his escape. Now, one of the issues I have with this is that Detective Houston is quite possibly the worst detective in history, as number one, he doesn't even question why this sliding glass door has been shattered, and number two, somehow doesn't notice all of the blood all over the balcony and think to himself, hey, I wonder why all this is out here. He doesn't even notice the set of fingers hanging up over the railing. Granted, I understand he's kind of not paying that close of attention to it, but still, he should have at least questioned what any of this was. He is a detective, and it is a big part of his job to go around and observe and collect evidence at a crime scene. Meanwhile, up on the roof of the apartment building, we see a locked fire exit door with the word exit crossed out and the word trap written above it, as we see the padlock holding it closed. This, however, does not even slow Job down as he smashes the door open and makes his way onto the roof, thinking to himself about how fighting Jeremiah tonight was never part of his plan, as he runs across the rooftop and we see a helicopter flying in the distance. He then thinks to himself about how this is the closest he's ever been to Sherry Majors and was able to smell her, and she smelled like sweat and orange peels. He also considers that he had to sacrifice Jeremiah so that Sherry could get a win. And I don't really understand exactly what he means by this. If this was something to do with him believing that Jeremiah is now dead, or if he perhaps thinks that he had to allow Sherry to believe that he, Citizen Payne, and the family man were the same person. It's not clearly explained exactly how all that goes, but he does realize that the night did not go in any way the way that he had planned, because he only wanted to talk to his brother, not actually get in a fight with him, as we see him jump off of the rooftop and grab onto the helicopter that's been approaching. The helicopter itself barely makes a noise, as it is actually a stealth craft that is referred to as a black helicopter, and has one of the ways that Citizen Payne has been able to evade capture by the police, using this to get him out of sticky situations. We then see Sherry Majors make her way up onto the roof just in time to see the helicopter flying off into the distance. She realizes that Job has once again given her the slip, as the other two officers come up onto the roof and ask if there's anyone here or if she's seen anything, and she simply turns around and tells them to go back into the building. Meanwhile, back in the apartment, we see that Detective Houston has finally decided to start doing his job and is looking around for clues and evidence. He happens to find a photograph that Jeremiah left lying on the floor, which is a picture of the North End mansion. At this point, Detective Houston says, "Dreams settle to become grass," which is a line from the poem that Jeremiah wrote on the wall of the family that he murdered in an earlier issue. Speaking of Jeremiah, he has made his way out of the apartment building, but is not able to get out of the alleyway because it's blocked off by the police. He thinks fast and breaks his way through the door of the adjacent building, makes his way through a storeroom, and walks out into some sort of rave-style dance club. The patrons of this dance club give him odd looks. Why wouldn't they? He's covered in blood and is wearing clothes that don't fit him. As he walks through the club, the bartender notices him and grabs one of the bouncers, telling him to go get this guy out of here. The bouncer tries to catch up to Jeremiah, stating, "Excuse me, sir," and when Jeremiah ignores him, he reaches out and grabs Jeremiah. Jeremiah does not take kindly to this as he instantly spins around and breaks the bouncer's arm. Another bouncer witnesses this and runs up trying to strike Jeremiah with what looks to be a blackjack, which is kind of hilarious that this is what he carries around on him to enforce security at a nightclub. And after witnessing this, the bartender decides that he's going to join in and help. However, he is stopped dead in his tracks when he then sees Jeremiah dragging the two bouncers behind him, stating, "I only want to walk out." The bartender decides that this is the best plan for him and states, "You're the man," as he drops his cut-off baseball bat, which I understand, yes, it's shorter and handier in this configuration, but it's also not nearly as devastating a weapon, given that you've just taken away a lot of the mass of the object. And Jeremiah releases the two bouncers, walks through the crowd, and goes back out onto the streets of Rancor Island, making his escape. Back outside the front of the apartment building, we see Detective Houston trying to chase down Lieutenant Majors. However, when he gets to her, Lieutenant Majors just begins unloading on him, screaming at him, stating, "You never ever give my officers the order to fire." He tries to apologize, but she cuts him off, stating, "There were civilians in this building. People could have been killed. What were you thinking?" Realizing how angry she is and how bad he messed up in this situation, he decides to try and give her a peace offering as he holds up the photograph that he found in the apartment. However, this only enrages Sherry even more as she screams at him, stating, "You took evidence from the scene? Are you out of your mind?" However, Houston responds by asking her to just look closer at it. She realizes that it is in fact a picture of the North End mansion, and Houston informs her, yes, this is evidence that we see linking this crime scene to the blown up apartment building where we found all that fanatical North End mansion stuff. I did good, right? Huh? As he smiles to her. However, this is something that Sherry does calm down a little bit about, but is also now kind of got her wheels turning inside of her head as she states, "This definitely means that you were right, Houston, that we're both looking for the same individual. Citizen Payne and the family man are the same guy." Now, of course, we know they're not. They're two different people. But as Sherry and Houston have never seen Jeremiah ever, they have no idea that he even existed. So it's very understandable to see how they could find this picture, link it to the other crime scene, and believe that Job is the only one that they're looking for. Sherry then starts to walk off, and Houston asks what she's doing. She states that she's going back to the North End mansion, and Houston starts to protest, stating, "Hey, maybe you should take along one of these big gun guys with you." Sherry states that she's only going to ask questions, but Houston kind of has enough at this point and starts to actually stand up for himself and yell at Sherry, stating, "You want to drop this whole tough as nails act that you're always walking around with?" He then starts to apologize again, stating that, I know that I'm not some super cop, but I am willing to walk around and have your back when you go to question people or go on missions like this. And I really believe that you're onto something, but you can't do this by yourself. And maybe it would behoove us to grab at least one really big gun guy to take along with us when we go on this mission. We see Sherry stop in her tracks and put her head down, and Houston states, "Listen, Sherry, I get it. You're a great cop, but you can't kick the whole world's ass on your own." Sherry at this point realizes that Houston is correct as she turns around and states, "I'm leaving in 5 minutes, so do what you gotta do." We are then teleported back to the convenience store where we saw the owner murdered in the previous issue. The man's daughter is in shock, sitting around just staring blankly at the wall as the investigating detective asks her questions about what she saw and if she knows of anyone that may want to hurt her father. As the crime scene investigators continue to go around and take pictures and gather evidence, we also see that the television is still running as it breaks in with a news report about the actions of Sherry Majors and her team and the fact that they once again engaged with Citizen Payne. We then see that the medical coroner and the ambulance drivers have loaded up her father's body and are wheeling it out. Upon seeing this, the young woman breaks down hysterically, screaming, "Daddy, please no, Daddy." As she tries to run toward her father's body, one of the officers grabs her and just holds her. The detective then asks another officer what exactly were the drugs that she had on her in her purse. The officer explains that these are all psychological medications and that they did a little bit of digging on her history, realizing that she has suffered from a lot of mental illness in her life. Nothing dangerous, she's just very prone to breakdowns. And the detective realizes that none of the questions he asked tonight are going to get him anywhere, as he instructs the officer to take the young woman home and make her call a social service worker and stay outside of her apartment all night to make sure that nothing happens to her. He then leaves and heads back to the station as we see the woman sitting on a stool crying over the loss of her father. We still don't know exactly how this subplot is playing into any of the story, but it's definitely going somewhere, you'd assume, given that they've devoted quite a bit of space to it in the past 2 issues. Meanwhile, at the North End mansion, we see Job's helicopter landing as his father is sitting outside waiting for him to get out. As Job exits the helicopter, his father simply states, "I'm disappointed in your extracurricular activities." Job tries to protest, stating, "Father, I'm tired, I need sleep now." However, his father states, "No, we have company and you need to deal with them at the moment." Job seems quite surprised and perplexed by this as he grabs his father's wheelchair and pushes him down a hallway in the mansion. As they enter what appears to be a library, Job's father states, "Here we are. Surely you remember the keepers of the family." 3 men who are definitely representing the aesthetic of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, except in this case, their mouth, ears, and eyes are all covered with steel plates bolted onto their bodies as we reach the end of this issue. We then get to Letters from the Flock, which is so long and so little of it is actually interesting. It's so much of just people writing in to say how great they think the comic book is. So I'm going to kind of speed through it and just touch on the 1 or 2 interesting letters as we go into the next page. As we reach pages 2 and 3 of the letter column, you will notice that it is nothing but letters. No reader submitted artwork or anything to kind of break up the monotony of just endless text. I will touch on one of the letters that I found interesting, and this letter came from a high school student who was reprimanded by his English teacher that told him that comic books don't count as literature when the teacher caught him reading an issue of Violent Messiahs in their class. However, this student then used the poem that was referenced in this issue for an assignment where he had to stand up, recite the poem, and explain what it meant. The teacher was actually rather impressed by it and found the poem itself and the explanation to be rather deep and profound, and asked the student, "Hey, where did this poem come from?" And the student then put a big old smile on his face and stated, "A comic book," kind of throwing it back in the teacher's face of like, "Hey, you completely dismiss this, even though you clearly think it's really well written," which is kind of a funny story. I'll give him credit. That was pretty cool. We then reach pages 4 and 5 of the letter column. Holy crap, it's so long. And at this point, I'm going to address the other letter I found to be interesting. It was the only critical letter that existed in all 5 of these pages. And the guy who wrote that letter even brings up the fact that they weren't really printing a lot of critical letters in the letter columns for Violent Messiahs. Now, in fairness, most of the comic books of Image were not printing critical letters. Todd McFarlane was very unique in the idea that he would print sometimes 2 full pages of exclusively critical letters in his letter column. The only problem is the guy who wrote that letter was incredibly smug and very, I guess, rude in the way that he brought up his criticisms, very dismissive about a lot of things. The one thing that he brought up that I found interesting was his criticism of all of the variant covers, many of which you can see right here on the bottom of page number 5. And the response he gets is something I've brought up in the past in other videos, that when companies like Marvel or DC are putting out, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 covers for a single issue, it is just greed. These companies are part of multi-billion-dollar media conglomerates. They're not hurting for money the same way as independent creators are. Especially in this instance where you have a small team that's working on a single title that they're putting out, and they've got to keep the lights on. And how do you do that? Well, variant covers to try and boost sales a little bit more, to make sure that you may remain financially viable as a comic book. That's not a big deal for something like Spider-Man, but it is a big deal for something like Violent Messiahs, which is not selling anywhere close to the number of copies that Spider-Man or Batman, or take your pick of any other of the major mainstream superheroes, are. So I'm a little bit more forgiving of it when we see it done by small independent creators, because I know what odds they're up against. We then get this wonderful pinup of Citizen Pain that was submitted by a trio of Gully, Paris, and Dresky, I think is how the last name is pronounced. It's hard to tell, it's spelled very oddly. And on the next page, we get an advertisement for issue number 5 of the Red Star. I unfortunately, at this moment, only have a handful of issues of the Red Star, and that is a tragedy. I want to get all of the Red Star so that I can make videos about it, because I love this comic book. I do own all of it in hardback collected editions, but in order to make the videos, I really need to have all of the single issues of the book. So once I get a hold of everything, I am going to be making an entire series about the Red Star. Make no mistake about it. So please stay tuned for that, and fingers crossed, one day I'll have all of the issues necessary to do that. We then get an advertisement for Main Event, Comics Greatest Girl Fight, Muse vs. Hex, in 10th Muse, starring Reyna Marrow, who many of you may know as Sable from the WWF, who is now currently Reyna Lesnar. At this point, she was still married to Mark Marrow, aka Johnny B. Bad, if you want to get real old school. Divorced him because she was cheating on him with Brock Lesnar, and then married Brock Lesnar. Interesting to see that expressionless plastic surgery face on the cover of a comic book. But, she was super famous at the time, so it's understandable that they would want to use her to try and bolster sales. We then get an advertisement for Scene Pieces, which is apparently an art book by Travis Smith. And I've never seen this, but if I ever came across it, I'd be really tempted to buy it. I'd at least thumb through it, but I dig what Travis Smith does. I really like it in terms of what it is just as art. I just question how appealing it is for a comic book cover more so than as actual fine art. But I really dig his style, and I would like to see more of the things he was doing that weren't directly related to comic books. On the final page of the book, we see Image Insider, which gives a shout out to both the 10th Muse and a 2-paragraph shout out to Eric Larson. Now, the one for the 10th Muse actually makes sense, as this was a relatively new book at the time. However, Eric Larson had been with the company since day one, so it seems as though he wouldn't have necessarily needed a real shout-out type of thing of like, hey, have you heard of Savage Dragon? I would hope so. It's been around since 1992 at this point. So it does seem odd that they would devote, the top third of the page to being like, hey, remember this other comic that we've been printing for like 8 years now? Make sure to pick that up too. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is essentially like an ACLU type of organization, but specifically for comic books. And this was just a call for people to donate to it to potentially fight lawsuits that were trying to end comic book censorship and protect creators from having their books banned from publication or being sold in comic book retail establishments. Honestly, it was really cool that this thing existed. I believe it still exists to this day, but I could be wrong. And if I am, please tell me in the comment section below. It's an important thing, you know, because of comic books having that basically perceived notion that they are specifically for children. They catch a lot more strays than other forms of entertainment. Like, for instance, movies, you have adult movies that are rated R and children's movies that are rated G. And everyone just kind of accepts that that's just normal and okay, that yes, you're going to have an animated family film for little kids, and then you're going to have some kind of crazy horror movie for adults, and they can exist within the same space. But comic books don't get that same luxury, and really only are kind of now, well, I shouldn't say now. It had happened probably around 2010-ish, like going into the 2010s, where it became way more acceptable for adult-themed comic books to exist in the same space as ones that are made for kids. And we kind of saw the transition happen with video games in that era as well. Now, of course, there are still people who try to fight all of that, but the numbers of people trying to censor that kind of stuff seem to grow smaller and smaller every year. Their voices get louder, don't get me wrong, but in terms of how well they're received at this point, I don't believe that they have the exact same kind of clout that they had back in the 90s and early 2000s. And that was Violent Messiahs number 4. Overall, I think this book did a really good job at progressing the story and also deepening the narrative, as we now have new characters introduced on the final page that we don't know how they play into the story exactly. We also have the new development that Sherry and Detective Houston believe that Job, Citizen Payne, is also the family man and is just going out committing horrible murders of all of these people around town. So things are definitely heating up within this story, and it's really questionable right now as to how things are going to pan out and where it goes from here. And I really appreciate what they did in terms of not letting us get too comfortable in what we thought this story was going to be versus what it's turning out to be. I always like stories that, you know, kind of keep you on your toes and never let you really get too settled into exactly what you're reading and give away the answers to the mysteries too soon. But then again, these are just my opinions. You might have thought that all of these twists and turns are confusing or seem nonsensical and just kind of ruin the flow of the story. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.